Hi guys, this week we are going to be talking about how artists use value and a whole range of different values to create form and texture and to give information about lighting sources. So we'll jump right into it. How do artists use value? Well, value really simply is a range of light colors to dark colors. And when we're talking about just using our pencils, you can kind of think about it like a grayscale, which is how we're going to be working with it this week. As you start to mix in colors, it can get a little bit more complicated, but for right now, we're just going to stick to our basic grayscale. So in this picture right here, we've got a cluster of some objects, and the values that are being used are telling you where the light source is. The light source is on the right-hand side. There's highlights over there. Highlights are the lightest areas of an object. There are shadows on the opposite side, so that's the darker areas. There are shadows on the insides of the objects, which lets you know that they're like actually three-dimensional. They have an inside to them. And then you can see the way that the artist has made the marks on this piece, that they're smooth. So they're probably made out of ceramic or something like that. They look like they've been smoothed out. So value can also let you know about the texture of an object. This week's vocabulary: value is one of our elements of the arts. It is the relative lightness or darkness on a line, a shape, or a form. And we use the word relative because if you put something relatively light next to something relatively dark, it'll create a really big contrast. It really just depends what you're setting it next to. We're going to talk about different types of marks this week too. So there are hatching lines. Hatching lines are repeating parallel lines. So they look a little bit something like this. These marks can be used to create value and texture as well. You will be using this type of mark in your value scales this week. So the more layers of hatching lines you have on top of each other, the darker your value is going to be. So that's an example of hatching lines. Cross-hatching lines are when you have, of course, crossing lines that are layered on top of each other. So the more layers of lines you have, the closer together those lines are. And like we kind of talked about last week in observational drawing, the harder you press down on your pencil, the darker your marks are going to be as well. When you're talking about shadows, those are the darkest areas. When we look at a couple of examples in just a little bit, I'll talk about cast shadows. Cast shadows are always going to be your darkest value in your drawing. So your shadows are opposite of where your light source is. And then of course the highlight, that's the brightest spot, and that is closest to your light source. So let's look at a few examples. This is an etching, which is a type of print made by an artist you may have heard of. His name is Rembrandt, and he uses a bunch of different types of marks in this etching. So even though he didn't use a pencil, he carved it into a sheet of metal, and then he made prints with it. You can see on his jacket where there are layers of lines crossed on top of each other. And when there are more layers, you can see it's a darker value. So like in the edge of his collar right here, underneath his hat, and then you can see, of course, that the shadows are on the left side of this image and the highlights are on the right side of this image. He also uses some marks to create texture. You can tell that he's got a fur-lined collar because the different types of marks that he's using, they're not all just like perfectly parallel marks like these ones. And his hair, of course, is curly. So where the hair is kind of overlapping, you can see the texture there as well. This is an example of something called cross contour lines. And cross contour lines are, you can kind of imagine it like if I were going to show you a sphere and a globe. So that globe is going to have longitude lines on it and latitude lines on it, and those marks are cross contour lines. So with this teapot, you can see where the curved lines follow around the curved surface of the teapot. And because this artist is using curved cross-hatching marks to create value, it's giving extra emphasis to the fact that this is a curved curved object. That's really important, and I'm going to talk about that when we talk about spheres as well. Using curved marks on curved objects is really going to help you create form. I say this all the time in the classroom. You can have a good drawing, but what's going to make it great is your control over highlights and shadows. So this is an example. The left-hand side, it's a good drawing. It's a drawing of what would be a marble bust, so it's a type of sculpture. And you know, if you were to really like squint your eyes and try and figure out where all the different values are in this, you could maybe find 3 or 4, but the darkest one isn't very dark. If you look at the one on the right-hand side though, the artist has really ramped it up. The highlights are really popping. The shadows are really, really dark, especially on the collar and along his cheekbone, in the curls and the wig of his hair. And it adds a lot of extra dimension. So you practicing with controlling your highlights and shadows and learning where those should go, controlling where all of your values should be, and finding a whole range of values. This week we're going to be practicing with 6. Some artists use, like 9, 12, 13, 15 different values. We're going to be practicing with 6 this week. But having that full range is really going to help you in your artist toolkit to create better pieces. So let's talk value scale a little bit more specifically. So this week, you are going to be creating value scales. I have a link to a YouTube video in the assignment notes for this. Another teacher has basically already done this and set it up for you guys, so I thought, why reinvent the wheel? But you will be working with 3 different types of marks for your value scales. You'll be using hatching marks, so parallel lines that are overlapping or parallel lines to each other. The closer together those lines are, the darker your value is going to be. You'll be using cross-hatching marks, so layers of lines overlapping each other in different directions. You can see those on this example right here. And then the last one is going to be blending. So just by using your pencil and having it on its side, you're going to create different values by pressing down hard on your pencil. So you can create different pressure on your pencil, and as you go from darker to lighter, you won't press down quite as hard. Like we talked about last week for our observational drawing, practice with how you're holding your pencil. For your darkest values, you're probably going to hold it like you usually hold your pencil for writing your name and stuff. But as you're working on those lighter values, you probably want to hold it back a little bit further. And I want you to practice using the side of your lead too. So of course you can do this with a mechanical pencil, but a classic pencil is going to work a little bit better. For those of you who have access to like drawing pencils, you're welcome to use those as well. The higher the number of an H pencil, the lighter the marks it's going to make. The higher the B number, the darker the marks you're going to make. Let's talk about using shadow to create form or to make something look 3-dimensional. So this can be a real struggle for students as you're learning how to draw. Where do the highlights go? Where do the shadows go? And like I just said with that bust drawing, turning a drawing that's good and making it great can really be, the difference can really be your control of value. So in this one, we have a sphere. Now, we know it's a sphere because of how this artist has shaded it, but of course it's just a flat drawing on a flat surface. So you'll notice right where the sphere is touching the ground, that's where the darkest value is going to be. Your cast shadow is always going to have your darkest value because that's where like absolutely no light is going to get. If you think about it, it's like you're walking down the street on a sunny summer day, your cast shadow is going to be like no sun is going to hit there. So it's going to be really dark. And then your light source and your highlight are going to be really close to each other. So the highlight is right here, which tells us that our light source is somewhere over in this direction. As you guys are playing with shading objects, one thing I want you to pay really close attention to are using the correct type of lines as you're shading your object. So these spheres have curved lines on them, kind of like those longitude and latitude lines that I was talking about. When you're drawing a curved surface, you don't want to use straight across marks. Those marks will make your picture look really flat if you're trying to make it look rounded, if you're trying to make something look full, if you're trying to make something look like a sphere, which is one of our goals for this week, and you're using straight across lines, it's just not going to be successful. So work on playing with different curved lines to create the values on the surface of what you're drawing. Here's another example, and they've got a little value scale down at the bottom. You'll notice, again, the darkest values are always going to be in the cast shadows, which is something that I want you guys to practice. And as these go along a curved surface, there's kind of a gradual change between the different values until you get to the highlight, which this artist has just left as plain white paper, which is a really great tool and a really great strategy for where your highlights are. So this is another example right there. I'm going to skip this one because it's repeating. You have a couple of other options in your handouts for creating some other types of objects. So one of your handouts is just spheres, and then one of them has some cylinders and some cubes in them. Cylinders, just like spheres, because they have curved surfaces, you're going to want to practice using curved marks for those, but things like cubes and rectangular prisms and triangular prisms, those are going to use straight lines. Because the surfaces are flat on them, you can just use straight across marks for those. And because they have sharp edges, there's not going to be a gradual change in between your values. You'll see that the top of this one is kind of all the same value. This is a medium value right here. This is a darker value, but again, that cast shadow right there is going to be your darkest value. This is one that's done digitally, but I think it does a good job of showing you some of the different surfaces. So light value, this is the highlight for this one. Medium, darker, the cast shadow is the darkest. Curved marks and lines on curved surfaces like spheres, and you'll see that there's a gradual change because light can kind of sneak around the curved edges of things like cylinders. And then final one, just an example. Of course, if you guys Google any of this stuff, there's so many different examples that you can find of what some of these objects look like. But in your handouts, you need to include highlights, cast shadows, so that really dark one, so that the cast shadows of whatever falls on a surface, and then a full range of mid values that you're going to be practicing with your value scales this week. Play around with the marks that you're using for these two. You can do some of them with cross-hatching lines, some of them with hatching lines, some of them trying to blend them. It's totally up to you, and you can play around with different textures with them too. So this week, value scale, you've got 3 different value scales in 6 values, so hatching lines, cross-hatching lines, and blending. You are going to have 2 handouts. If you don't have access to a printer, you of course can make your own. The way that I always make my own in the classroom for demo is I grab a tape roll, this is a duct tape roll, and I just trace around the inside of it like this, super low tech, and then you can work on shading that in with those nice curved marks to create your value and to make it look rounded. So those are your assignments for this week to practice. Awesome.